Trent, welcome.
Hey, Christian.
We can do the whole presidential thing.
Hey, guys.
Just in case anybody doesn't know who Trent is, Trent, what is your full name?
My name is Trent Stephen Martin.
Fantastic. I'd like to do a bit of an introduction so everyone gets to know you.
Cool.
What's your favourite colour?
Blue.
Favourite sport?
NRL.
That'll do.
It's good to tackle a man.
Something
going
like
down
that.
on the ground.
I'm done. Have fun.
Thanks, bro. You actually are talented. You may be talented musically, but you've got a good beard, bro. Hey, it's great to be back at Dandy Polish Church, and welcome again to our special time of Agape with Jesus. Before I get into my message, I just want to point out something that you would have received as you entered the door this morning. It looks like this. It's a gift to you, and we just invite you to open this up when you get home today as you reflect on your experience here at Agape with Jesus. Hey, before we talk about the table, before we talk about the word, before we talk about Jesus, let's just pray. Jesus, you're incredible. There is no one like you. And there is a reason that there are people in this building here today. It's not because it's pretty to look at. It's not because there's great food afterwards. It's not just because there are great people here. But I think for most of us here, the reason we're here is because of you. That 2,000 years after your first experience at a table like this one before us, you displayed and you still display such love, such care, and such kindness. And you're the sort of person we all need. And Lord, I just want to pray that as we reflect on the Last Supper that you shared that night, and that Last Supper that we still want to share with you now, I just want to ask that you be here and that you bless. Amen. Isn't this interesting, this table with all of these beautiful decorations? I love tables because when you see a table, you know there's probably going to be food, and who doesn't love food? We're going to be talking about this table this morning. We're going to be talking about the Last Supper that was first shared on a table that might have looked something like this. We're going to be talking about especially the relationships and the emotions that would have existed around the table at the first Last Supper. And if you were with us last night, you'll remember that as the disciples joined Jesus in this meal, there was significant historical symbolism going on in the background. From the original Passover, the disciples with Jesus remembered how God had set his people free from slavery in Egypt so long ago. But for Jesus and his closest friends that night, there was no Egyptian Pharaoh to be fearful of. There were no mud bricks to produce. There were no slave masters to appease anymore. Instead, for the disciples around that table, there was an enemy that was much closer to home. A slave driver who was far more personal to them and hard to escape from. It was like Jesus had once said when he was speaking to some of the Jews who were now free from their slavery in Egypt. He said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And the crowd of doubters responded to him, "But we are descendants of Abraham," they said. "We have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean you'll be set free?" Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth. Anyone who sins is a slave to sin." Interesting, isn't it? Interesting that so long after their slavery in Egypt had come to an end, that these guys were still enslaved to something that was far more destructive and internal. It's like Peter once said. Peter was at the table with Jesus that night, you remember. And Peter, in reflecting on this whole slavery thing, he once said, "You are a slave to whatever controls you." If you've got something that controls you today, Peter says that you are a slave to that thing because it literally dictates your moves, your habits, your thoughts, your interactions with people. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. But I remember I was once a slave. My slave masters were numerous. One was called ego, sometimes referred to as pride. Another slave driver was called self-dependence. I have always had this streak of self-dependence. I don't need God. I don't need anyone. And that slave driver kept me from freedom for a long time. Another slave driver that I had was called lust. You may be familiar with this one. He was probably the most soul-destroying slave driver that I've ever had. I followed his every command and even enjoyed him as my master much of the time. But after following his orders, I would always feel so empty and filthy. Another slave driver, and you might be surprised by this one, but I call it that for a reason, was called brokenness. Brokenness. He always accompanied the other slave drivers, pushing me into deeper hopelessness, thinking that my brokenness would always make me go back to those familiar old slave masters. Because when you have brokenness that you're trying to carry around, you'll seek anything in the hope of becoming whole again. Doesn't matter what it is or how miserable you feel, you'll still go back to it. Because for a moment you think maybe that it is the answer. And that's why so many of us are drawn to offer our lives so freely to our slave masters. We don't realize how to find true healing. We don't yet know how it feels to be truly loved. And the concept that there is someone up there who would love us so completely and unconditionally seems too good to be true often. And because of this misconception, it's like, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but it's like we lose hope. Imagining that the only way to live our lives is as a permanent slave to this misconception, brokenness, and sin. Well, the disciples were no different. There were 12 of them as they took the stairs up to the upper room that evening of the Last Supper. And they'd been taking steps beside Jesus, their humble leader, for over 3 years at this point, sleeping in the same rooms or under the same stars and talking late into the night around the same fires. Jesus had become everything to them. He was now the center of their lives, but all that was about to change. And I reckon they sensed it. In fact, Jesus had spelled it out for them. There were 13 spaces around a table with the Passover lamb cooked to perfection. God had always been very specific about these things at this table, and there was a reason. There was bread and there was grape juice. And it was all done in accordance with those very specific instructions when God had released his people from their physical slavery in Egypt. They were still doing it 2,000 years later. And as they entered that upper room that night, the first question that probably entered most of their minds was, where am I going to sit? Where should I fit in here? Like, where's Jesus going to... And this is the sort of question that we often ask when we go into someone's home for a meal around their table, right? You get in the front door and you're like, oh, shoes on or off? And they're like, no, don't worry about your shoes. And then you walk through to the dining room and you're thinking to yourself, do I just sort of pick a seat and just sit down and whichever one looks good to me? Or do I wait for the host to show me to my seat? And you don't want to get this wrong. I got it wrong one time. I was at my grandparents' place as a young kid. And as the food was all being prepared in the kitchen, I thought to myself, where should I sit at this 6-seat table? And I thought to myself, well, Nana and Granddad, they're so in love, even though they're like old, they're still in love for some reason. And I reckon they probably want to sit really, really close to each other on the side of the table. So I sat at the end of the table on a seat that was actually quite like this one. And my Nana, I remember her as I'm sitting there as a young boy. she comes up to me as she's bringing the food to place on the table. I think it was potato soup probably. She always cooked a great potato soup. And she comes to me and I remember her just whispering in my ear, "Hey Trent, that's the seat that Granddad always sits in." And I was like, "Oh, no, Nana, I'm sorry." And with a red face, the younger Trent took his rightful seat on the side of the table. Granddad sat at the end, and the dinner proceeded just like normal. And this whole table sitting arrangement becomes incredibly important at wedding ceremonies, where in the reception hall, the tables and the places at them are clearly marked with each guest's name on it. Here we'll typically have tables with around 10 places at each, and there's these cute little name cards that they've chosen out of like 100 different options because they're just what they wanted. And the bride and groom, they go to great lengths to seat each guest at a table space where they'll have the best possible experience. And there are many things to consider in this process. How close should that person sit to the bridal table in accordance with their perceived closeness of their relationship with the bride, groom, or both? How many times has the mother-in-law reminded us about the importance of this auntie in her life? How generous was this person's gift at the engagement party? Let's be honest. Does this person have any history of interpersonal conflict with any of the other attendees at the reception? Who does this person like hanging out with out of the others that are at the reception hall? And how much of a fuss would they cause if they were placed next to that weird uncle who always happens to talk too long about his recycled collection of fish hooks? And the list goes on. Table seating is a difficult affair, especially for people who have history and who are complicated. And I reckon it would have been the same at that table that night in the upper room with the disciples and Jesus. These men were complicated. And these men had a history with each other and with Jesus. And that was about to affect everything that happened that evening. Who do you reckon would have sat down first? Who was the first person to take a seat at this table? I'm going to hazard a guess, and I'm going to say that Jesus, he wanted to make everyone comfortable. He wanted to just sort of set the scene. I reckon Jesus would have sat here in the middle of the table so that he could see all of the other guys around him. And so as Jesus takes his seat, the others are wandering in, and he's the one sitting there, and he's just got this smile on his face. But underneath that smile that he was putting on, underneath that attempt to be confident, that attempt to just calm the nerves of the rest of the guys at that table, Jesus must have had feelings going on. Firstly, he must have been physically exhausted. His last week had been incredibly busy. On the physical side, he'd traveled long distances to get to Jerusalem. He'd been upturning tables in the temple, preaching his heart out in front of vast crowds of people who were coming because they needed to hear his words. He'd been escaping the attempts of his enemies to murder him throughout that week and trying to keep up with all the conversations of people who were just really needing to talk to Jesus. On top of that, he'd been healing all sorts of people who really needed physical healing. And he must have been wasted by the time he sat down at his place at the table. And then underneath all that physical exhaustion and mental weariness, there was this awareness, this deep awareness for Jesus that this was it for him. This was his last night. At this time, the next night, he'd be dead, buried, wrapped up in burial cloths, lying down in a cold tomb. And he'd been carrying around that knowledge with him all week as he went around just caring for all these different people. And as he sat down, at the table that night, despite the physical rest that this seat would have afforded him, Jesus was carrying burdens that must have felt infinitely heavy. And not only that, but he was aware that his imminent death would be ushered in by the betrayal and abandonment of some of the closest guys to him that were also going to be sitting around this table. And I imagine each of them entering the room and finding their places around Jesus. I reckon the first ones to enter the room and to take their rightful positions at the table would have been these guys. Firstly, there was James. There were two Jameses, but this was James, who was the son of a guy named Zebedee. And then there was John, who was James's brother, also son of Zebedee, obviously. And I reckon that these two guys would have sat next to Jesus. And there was a reason for this. It wasn't because they just really liked Jesus. It wasn't because they really just wanted to sort of be close to him, to say hi to him and crack a few jokes in jest. But there were other reasons that we'll share. But these two guys, James and John, these guys were brothers who had been with Jesus since the very first day that he had followers, that he had disciples. It was only 3 or so years ago, but it must have felt like an eternity had passed. They were in their dad's fishing boat that day, and they were just repairing their fishing nets. And so their boat was just by the shore, just a little bit out maybe, but within walking distance off the bank. But don't imagine that these two fishermen were just like poor, uninfluential men. Their dad, Zebedee, was at least rich enough and doing well enough in his fishing business to have several other men apart from them employed as his workers. And John had connections with the high priest in Jerusalem. And then he called their names. James, John, follow me and be my disciples. And as they heard him call their names, as if he already knew them, these guys looked up, and as they saw Jesus, they would have seen two guys beside him. These two were also fishermen. We'll be talking about them later. They were competitors in the fishing industry in that area. They just fished a little way down the shore, and their names were Simon and Andrew. You might know Simon also as Peter. They were also brothers. And maybe it was their familiarity with Peter and with Andrew, or maybe it was something about Jesus' presence there. But both James and John left their boat, left their work immediately, and followed Jesus. And that's when everything changed for them. Over the next 3 years, they experienced incredible things. They witnessed countless healings of people who couldn't hear, see, walk, or talk. They were beside Jesus in times of controversy. They witnessed things that they never thought were possible. There was that time when they were beside Jesus as that woman was about to be stoned to death because she cheated on her husband. And then Jesus loved her and saved her from that. Jesus was a different sort of person to what they might have expected from a religious man in that time. And they experienced this. And then only days before the Last Supper, they literally saw Jesus raise a man from the dead. The guy had been dead for like 3 days. He stank. And they literally saw Jesus call this guy back to life. They touched Lazarus. They hugged him. They saw him. They heard him speak. And this was the sort of experience that these brothers James and John had had with Jesus. And these guys, they were brothers for life, right? They knew what it was like to be intimately known by another person. But being known by Jesus was entirely different. Because Jesus, he was a man who knew everything about you. Like everything. He knew the good stuff, he knew the bad stuff, he knew the deep secrets, he knew the shame, he knew those hidden sins that you'd never let anyone else know about. Your most shameful thoughts and sins were known by him as he looked into your eyes with those piercing stares. But he also knew the good in you. Unlike other people, he knew that there was some place deep down where you wanted to be different, where you didn't want to be that person enslaved to your issues, your sin, your brokenness, your misconception. And so for these guys, this was the man they had come to know. And they weren't without their issues as Jesus looked into their eyes. James and John, their issue seems to have been a thirst for power. That was the name of their slave driver. There was that one time when they sent their mum to try to convince Jesus to let them be like the left and the right-hand men of Jesus in his physical kingdom that they really, really wanted him to set up. The other disciples were indignant about this, of course. They hated James and John because James and John were always trying to one-up everyone else and trying to be the big, important men beside the king. These two guys were power hungry. Like the time when they came to Jesus, and it was John in this case, who said, "Master, we saw someone else using your name to cast out demons, but we told him to stop because he isn't in our group." And Jesus was like, "John, what are you doing, John? If those guys are doing good stuff in my name, don't stop them. It's not just about being in the group. It's not about you, John. What are you doing, mate?" But it even went further than that with these two brothers. Like there was that time when Jesus, he was going to that Samaritan village. You remember the village, right? And that village of people, they all rejected Jesus, the Bible says. And instead of just walking on to the next village and going, okay, well, let's work with the next group of people and see if they can accept God's love. These guys, John and James, you know what they said to Jesus, right? They're like, "Jesus, can we call down fire from heaven to burn all these people alive?" I mean, that's the nature of James's and John's hearts. Power hungry, egotistical maniacs. I mean, that's the sort of stuff that Hitler did. It's genocide. They're calling for genocide. And as Jesus sat with these two guys at his table that night, he still loved them. And at every turn, he would simply say things to them like, "Guys, it's not about being big and powerful. It's not about being important. It's not about being the big man. It's actually about serving people, John. It's actually about loving people, James. It's about being humble and patient." And so that's James and John, sitting on Jesus' left and right, once again grabbing for the places of importance beside the big man. And I wonder if there's anyone in this room who can relate to these two guys. The next card I have is Levi. You remember Levi, right? Where would he have sat? Well, the name Levi means to take, which was quite appropriate considering that Levi made a very fat living by taking from everyday families. Levi's slave master was called greed, selfishness. And he had shown the propensity to do anything in order to get what he wanted. Maybe that's why he later preferred to be called by the name Matthew, which means the gift of the Lord. Yeah, see that difference? It's like the two names are opposite. One is to take, one is to give. And while James and John had come from upstanding positions as good, righteous Jews who were businessmen and connected with the religious elite, they still retained the pride that came with their apparent righteousness. But Matthew, Levi, had a very different background. I reckon he would have sat here. opposite Jesus. And if you're wondering why, remember the journey that Matthew Levi had gone on since he had completed and gotten rid of that background of slavery to greed and selfishness. Because Matthew just wanted to see Jesus, to see his love and grace. Because Matthew's first experience, you remember it, right? The first time he saw Jesus across from him happened like James and John on the seashore of Galilee again. It was a little while after James and John had been called, and Jesus had by this time developed a solid reputation in the region as being the guy that healed everyone and loved everyone and cared for people and fixed up their problems. And he was this big religious hero who had a smile on his face when he looked at you. And Matthew would have no doubt heard about this great, wise, important miracle worker and teacher. And maybe he was even aware of the prophecy where God said, "But there will be a time in the future when Galilee, beside which Levi had always worked, which lies along the road and runs between the Jordan and the sea, will be filled with glory. The people who walk in darkness," Levi, "will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine." And that's about what Levi was about to experience. Because he saw Jesus as Jesus was walking along the lakeshore that day. And Levi, you can imagine how he must have felt in that moment. Probably the same way that he felt whenever any religiously pious, righteous man walked past. Absolutely ashamed. No one who is enslaved to greed really wants to be that way, if they're honest. No selfish person really enjoys being that way, if they're honest. And so what is Levi going to do? Should Levi hide behind his tax collector's booth and sort of hope that Jesus just passes him by? That booth was stained with corruption. Levi was a thief. He was a criminal whose crimes hadn't been punished only because his corruption rose right to the top through chief tax collectors like Zacchaeus and all the way up even to the Roman emperor. It was sanctioned theft from everyday people, and the people hated him for it. He was a man who had stolen from every family in the region. This man would not just take the amount of tax that was fair, but he would also add a ridiculous amount of extra on top and then keep that for himself. His existence was made fat off the suffering of poor people. And you've got to wonder, like, how many families had Levi made poor because of his greed? How many meals had the poorest of those families had to miss because he had taken their money? I don't know about you, but I think of Levi as one of the worst types of sinners. Deeply enslaved. And so you can imagine that as Jesus is approaching Levi in his tax booth there on the side of the shore of Galilee, that he just wants to hide. He just wishes he could just get away because this man, Jesus, he's just not worthy of this man. What do you think you'd do in that situation? I don't know what I'd do. What was Levi going to say in that situation? I don't know what I was going to say. But Jesus comes up to him, and as Jesus approaches him, he's about to say something. His mouth is starting to open. He's about to speak to Levi as he's hiding behind his booth there. What's he going to say? Levi must have wondered. I can imagine what Levi thought he was going to say. Levi, you corrupt, evil, greedy man. You will never change your ways, Levi. You are a hopeless case, Levi. Not even I can help someone as filthy as you. I give up. I'm letting go of this. I don't even want you near me, you pathetic piece of scum. But is that what Jesus said? Is that the sort of thing that Jesus says to a sinner who is enslaved? No. Jesus simply came up to him and he said, "Follow me and be my disciple." It's like a short thing. Follow me and be my disciple. But there's so much meaning in there, and you can imagine the thoughts that were going through Levi's mind and the emotions in his heart as he's hearing Jesus say these things. I mean, he must have been totally surprised, taken aback, and utterly shocked. Jesus was a good and important man, and yet he wanted Levi, the scumbag, sinner, thief, to be in his inner circle of followers and friends? Like, that's amazing to me. And it would have been amazing to Levi. And I don't know what happened in Levi's heart that day, but he was impacted enough that he walked away from that booth of corruption, greed, and sin. His slavery to that sin was broken by Jesus, and he followed him into a new life. And so I picture Levi here, sitting across from Jesus, gazing into his eyes of love, that one man who believed in him when no one else would, and that one man whose love had saved him from that old life. And I wonder if there's anyone here who can relate to Levi. The next one I have is Peter. You remember Peter, right? Peter is probably the most funny guy in the Bible to read about. I look at Peter and I'm just like, dude, I would love to get inside your head. I would love to study you as a psychological experiment, because this guy, Peter, was something else. Peter was an interesting guy, and as he entered the room that night, I reckon he looked straight at the spots beside Jesus. I reckon he looked straight at the spots where John and James might have already occupied, and he probably thought, man, I really wish I could have sat there. James and John, stop doing this whole thing where you're always trying to be next to the king. But I reckon he sat as close as he could next to Jesus, probably here. His brother's name was Andrew, as you might remember. Andrew would have probably hung out with Peter here. Those two were close. Because Peter was obsessed with Jesus. He was fiercely self-dependent as well, but he was obsessed with Jesus. And unlike James and John here, Peter isn't mentioned as having worked for his dad. He was the man. He was independent Peter. He was also a family man with a wife and probably some kids. He had it together. And he was often the first to speak when Jesus addressed the group. You know how it works, right? A guy like Peter sitting here, he was the guy who rose to the top of the group as kind of the leader of them all. And there's always a person in a group of this size that sort of stands aside and becomes that figure. But Peter was an interesting guy. He was a guy who, when Jesus was having that important conversation with Moses and Elijah, the Bible says that Peter started nervously speaking. He just sort of blurted something out because he didn't know what to say. You felt like that before, right? When you're in the presence of someone important. So Peter that day, he just sort of started awkwardly speaking, and he's like telling Jesus, like, Jesus, do you want me to like make a little hut for you guys and you can like talk and stuff? And the Bible actually says this interesting thing, that the Father spoke from the sky and literally interrupted Peter mid-sentence. I find that really funny, actually. And the Father says this. He says, "This is my Son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And as the Father is interrupting Peter, I can't help but wonder if he's kind of directing his words primarily toward Peter. It's like he's saying, hey, Peter, you think you're the big man. You think you're the leader here. You're not the big man. You're not the leader. Jesus is my Son. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him, not yourself. But Peter, despite that whole ego and that whole pride thing that he had going on, he had a great deal of trust in Jesus. And this deep admiration and loyalty that was just so strong for Jesus. Like the time when, after Jesus had been talking about his body and his blood, and most of his followers were weirded out or offended. You remember that day, right? I mean, that was the day that most of Jesus' followers literally walked away and never came back. And as Jesus was seeing this crowd of people abandoning him as the Lamb of God, he has a chat with the disciples and he says to them, "You don't want to leave me too, do you?" And the Bible says that it was Peter who stepped forward and said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe in you and to know that you are the Holy One of God." I mean, clearly Peter was bonded with Jesus in a way that was quite rare and beautiful. And there was a great trust from Peter toward Jesus. I mean, like the time when Peter and the rest of these guys, they were in the boat that night, there was a big storm, and fearing for his life, Peter, he was the one that saw Jesus walking on the water, and he had enough trust to step out of the boat onto the waves and to walk on water toward Jesus in the middle of that storm. None of the other guys did that sort of stuff. None of the other guys seemed to have that sort of boldness and trust. Peter was courageous. Later that night, after this whole Last Supper thing had been finished up, Peter would risk his life by trying to defend Jesus from the soldiers by cutting off one of the dude's ears. And it's one of those situations again where you just got to laugh and you go, "Peter, you try so hard, but you go such like a small distance. You try so hard, but all you could do in defending Jesus was to chop off a dude's ear." It's like, and that's the sort of guy that I really have come to see Peter as. He's this kind of bold, kind of half awkward dude that steps out too far sometimes, but there's an endearing nature about him that you just got to love. But Peter's issue was that same old self-dependence he'd always had. He thought he was the big hero. He thought he was the big man. Peter's slave master would have been called pride, ego, self-dependence, and he was absolutely enslaved to it. In fact, just minutes after Peter took his seat that night, he would have the following conversation with Jesus. Peter declared to Jesus that night, he said, "Even if everyone else deserts you, I will never desert you." Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth, Peter. This very night before the rooster crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." Peter responded straight back and he's like, "No! Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you, Jesus." On one hand, it was like Peter was this great friend toward Jesus, loyalty that could not be matched by anyone else. But on the other hand, he was still enslaved to his self-dependence and pride and ego. And that's kind of where he fell down. So that's Peter. And I wonder if there's anyone in this room who can relate to Peter. The next card I have in my hand is this one. It's Judas. Now, there were 2 Judases. It was a common name, it seems, in those days. But this is the one you all remember the most. He's probably the most remembered disciple of them all, in fact, and for the most tragic of reasons. I reckon Judas sat here, but I reckon he would have moved his chair like this, and his plate like this. I reckon he would have taken these sorts of jars and built them up like a little wall between him and Jesus. Chucked some bread on the top just to make it nice and high. Anything to stop Jesus from being able to see him. Judas was the treasurer of the group, handling all the money that was collected and paying all the expenses that were incurred. If the disciples needed food, Judas was the man who would provide the money for it. If they needed a motel, Judas would take care of it. if they received a donation of money or valuables. It was Judas who was responsible to take charge. But this wasn't just something that Judas did because he was better at counting than the other disciples around that table. Judas was clearly drawn to money. Money was his slave master. It consumed him right until the end of his life. Like the time only days before Jesus was going to sacrifice his life for Judas and the rest of the people around, there was that woman, right? You remember her. She came with that expensive jar of beautiful perfume. And she just poured that jar liberally out onto Jesus' feet. And Judas, he was watching on with this expression of disgust at what was going on. And as that beautiful woman used her long hair to wipe Jesus' feet with such a lovely, heartfelt gesture, all Judas felt was rage and disdain for what he was seeing. I mean, he hated what was going on. Who cares about Jesus? That perfume could have been sold for money. And in one of the Gospels, this is interesting, in one of the Gospels, the very next thing that happens in the chronology is that Judas walks out of that whole burial perfume hair thing. He goes straight to the head priests and he says, "How much will you give me if I sold Jesus' life to you?" That's what was going on with Judas. This was a man who was corrupt to his core, and later that night, he would do the final act of facilitating Jesus' murder with the tragic symbol of a kiss on the cheek. That's Judas, the coward, sitting here on the side of the table, the slave to money. And I wonder if there's anyone who can relate to Judas in this room today. Then there are the doubters. Now, the doubters, these are guys like Thomas. We'll put Thomas over here. He's sort of on the side, doesn't want to get too close to Jesus, doesn't want to be beside him or sitting in front of him. He's sort of off to the side. Thomas was a doubter. These are guys like Simon, maybe, the other Simon. And these are guys like Philip. You remember how Philip, he was always the sort of guy who was like, "Oh, Jesus, I don't know, are you actually for real?" Then you have some of the other guys, as Bartholomew, the other James, the other Judas. We don't know too much about these guys. They were kind of the quiet guys that sort of were still on the side as well. But I want to talk to you about these doubters for a moment. Their slave master was this distrust that they had for Jesus, despite a huge amount of evidence of his love and his deity. Maybe they were broken people who were abused by those who were supposed to be able to be trustworthy in their life. Maybe that's why they struggled to trust even a man like Jesus. I reckon they would have sat together here on the side, just watching to see what Jesus was going to do that night. Maybe that's why they were always finding reasons to play the role of critic. But they were the fence sitters, slave to brokenness, to doubt, to misconception and distrust, the doubters. And as each of these men, with all of their eccentricities, faults, with all of their endearing traits as well, as each sat at the table that night, we see a group of men who had deep issues for sure, who were enslaved to their own various sins, brokenness, and misconceptions. Each one of them had been with Jesus and experienced his great love for each one of them. Each one of them felt deeply known, accepted, and loved by this man. And though they were still each living as slaves to their issues, all that was about to change. Because just as their forebears in Egypt, when they first celebrated this Passover meal, had once been slaves, there was a lamb who was able to set them free from that. There was a lamb who, through his sacrifice, would within hours give his life to make their freedom possible. And I wish that they could have known, while Jesus was still sitting with them that night, the sort of freedom that they were about to receive from him. Where there was sin, it would be washed away. Where there was pride, humility would replace it. Where there was brokenness, healing would come. Where there were burdens, they would be lifted. And I don't know if there are people in this room today who can resonate with these disciples, but I know that I can. I don't know what enslaves you or what brokenness you carry, what conceptions you may have about this man Jesus. But he can change all of that. As the disciples ate the meal that night, Jesus told them to eat some bread and have some grape juice. He was very specific, just like he'd been at that first Passover in Egypt, that these were symbols of his body that was going to be broken and sacrificed for each one of them. This was his great gesture. The centerpiece, not just of that table, but also the centerpiece of his love. I don't know about you, but when I've experienced God's love for me, I can't help but give my whole life just over to him. And when I have handed my life over to him, he comes and he breaks the chains of my slavery. Those familiar old slave drivers become powerless and are replaced by someone who I can look up to, put my hope in, and learn to love in the same way that he has loved me. And it is nothing less than life-changing. But it doesn't always happen immediately. The first time that we sit at this table with Jesus, it doesn't always happen that first night. For some of us, we'll need to sit at the table many times before we finally get God's love for us. And if you remember the story of the disciples at the table this night, you'll know that any high hopes that Jesus had for this dinner being some great dinner that would change their hearts finally, they would give their hearts over to him and everything would be different. If Jesus had any of those hopes, they were absolutely dashed by the end of this dinner. Because at this table, all they seemed to care about was who was the greatest. There was a fight that broke out. They were all arguing with each other. James was arguing with Levi. John was arguing with Simon. They were all like, no, I'm the greatest. I'm going to be sitting next to Jesus when he defeats the Romans, sets up a kingdom. I'm going to be the dude that's like reclining back and eating the grape. Like, this is the sort of thing that was still happening, even at this Last Supper. And as he left the upper room for Gethsemane after that dinner that night, you can imagine how deflated Jesus must have felt. And 24 hours later, he was dead, buried in a tomb, wrapped in linen cloth, and that was it. And if we ended our discussion there, we might feel as if this Last Supper was a wasted last-ditch effort of Jesus to somehow change the stubborn, enslaved hearts of these men. But I don't think it was wasted. Because something happened after that night, and if you check in on the lives of these disciples some years later, you see some fascinating things. With the exception of Judas over there, each one of these guys experienced a transformation that could only be described as a literal miracle. I mean, Peter. Where's Peter? Peter, he became a great man as he finally accepted Jesus as his actual hero. He even gave his life as a crucified martyr. But get this. He said to the guys who were about to crucify him, guys, no. This is how Jesus was crucified. I'm not even worthy of dying in the same way that my master died. I'm not this proud man who wants to be the big guy that's being all, just hang me upside down. I'm not even worthy of dying like my master died. Peter, he was a changed guy. He didn't even count himself worthy as dying the same death. Matthew here, this guy was cool. He became a really great Christian leader, preaching mostly to Jews about the true Lamb, the fulfillment of that ancient prophecy that they were still celebrating. He changed the world. The amount of people that got to know Jesus and were freed from their own personal slavery because of that was just immense. I mean, it was huge. You've read the gospel. Matthew Levi also died for his relentless faith in Jesus. And the reason, when we could talk about all these other guys, there's guys that traveled to India, there's all sorts of people that died for their belief in Jesus. In fact, I think every one of them was someone who gave their life for Jesus, except for this guy, John. John ended up being on Patmos, but the rest of these guys, they literally gave their lives because they loved Jesus so much. And the reason I share their story with you today is this. The disciples were everyday people just like you and I. And just like the disciples had their own addictions, their sins, their brokenness and slavery to misconception, I reckon we do too. Nothing's changed. And I know that in your experience, sometimes you feel absolutely hopeless, like these guys often felt, about the state of your own life. Sometimes you feel like these things that you do and feel and are will never change. You go, nah, hopeless case. But like Peter, you've tried so hard in your own strength, and maybe now you're even worse than you were when you first started. But I'm here to tell you one thing: God loves you. Like, God seriously loves you. And God is powerful. He can break your chains of slavery to sin. He can heal any brokenness that exists in you. He can change any misconception that you might have about Him or yourself. And the path to that freedom from your slavery is simple. And it's found at the table with Jesus. Because there is a moment in the life of every Christian when you finally see Jesus as He truly is. You see His body and His blood as they're broken for you. You see that His love went all the way to the death on the cross just for you. You see His love. And you have your eyes opened. For some, you saw it straight away. And you experience that freedom and you've never been the same. For others of you, you need to keep sitting with Jesus at the table and do it more often until His love actually finally sinks into the depth of your heart. But I want you to know along that journey that Jesus, as He persevered with even guys like Judas, Peter, James, John, I want you to know that He's going to persevere with you until you finally accept that love. And like Peter, if you come to Him in your failure, He will never let you down. I've experienced this in my life. That's why I'm a Christian now. I wouldn't even be standing up here and preaching. I'd probably be doing something else on Saturdays every weekend if it wasn't for the fact that Jesus, when I realized His deep love for me, He changed me from the inside out. He broke all my slavery to addiction and to brokenness. He bandaged me up and made me a whole person. And it was miraculous to look at as I progressed in my life with Him. My misconceptions about Him and the nature of His love or otherwise for me were just completely abolished as I sat with Him and I saw the depth of His love, that He even went to death for me. I know some of you in this room today, you've been Christians for many years, maybe your whole life, and you're still struggling with the same old slavery to addiction or sin or brokenness or misconception. And sometimes you feel like, is it hopeless? Should I just give up on this whole walking with God thing? Should I just stop doing it? I want you to know that as you sit with Jesus and as you're open to seeing his love, it will become absolutely clear, not just in your head, but in your heart, that his love for you is so much more than you ever thought. And when you finally see that, that's when everything is going to change for you. So keep sitting at the table. Keep looking at Jesus, and you will find your freedom.